Mamy jednak mówców, którzy są anglojęzyczni, dlatego też sesja odbędzie się w języku angielskim. Jedna uwaga jest taka, że dwie prezentacje będą przedstawione w formie filmu, ponieważ pan profesor z Uniwersytetu St. Thomas w Houston, więc pan profesor Corrigan i pan profesor Burgos będą występowali z nagrania. Natomiast ja będę prowadzić tę sesję razem z panem Jacobem François. To jest seminarzysta, który zostanie wyświęcony w grudniu tego roku na diakona, więc zapraszam pana Jacoba François. Ojciec wierzy w opatrzność, tak jak wszyscy Polacy. Wierzę też, że nasz papież będzie przyjazny dla wszystkich. Natomiast teraz pan Jove Aquas połączy się z nami z Filipin. To jest przedstawiciel Uniwersytetu Świętego Tomasza w Manili na Filipinach i będzie mówić na temat doskonałości, potęgi i integracji osoby. Święty Tomasz z Akwinu oraz Karol Wojtyła, co mieli do powiedzenia o cnocie. Zapraszam Państwa do wysłuchania wykładu. Witam Państwa serdecznie. Czuję się zaszczycony, że mogę występować na tej konferencji. Będę starać się skrócić nieco moje wystąpienie, tak żeby nie przekroczyć przypisanego mi czasu. Natomiast chcę powiedzieć, że przyjechałem z drugiego końca świata. Chcę powiedzieć, że zacznę od refleksji filozoficznych. Będę mówić o tym, że nasze wierzenia są pod wpływem naszych przeżyć oraz naszych przekonań. Jednym z tych, czym się martwimy obecnie, jest zepsucie moralne. Dlatego też chciałem przedstawić Państwu w związku z tym pewne lekcje moralne, wnioski moralne, które płyną z pism świętego Tomasza z Akwinu oraz Karola Wojtyły. Więc chcę powiedzieć, że święty Tomasz z Akwinu i Karol Wojtyła, co mieli do powiedzenia na temat cnoty. Zepsucie moralne, którego doświadczamy w dzisiejszym społeczeństwie, można przypisać nieobecności charakteru moralnego w naszym społeczeństwie. Nieuczciwość, brak integralności, spadek szacunku dla osoby ludzkich, rozpad wartości rodzinnych i społecznych, wzrost niesprawiedliwości społecznej, powszechny materializm oraz moralny relatywizm, wzrost przestępczości i przemocy, normalizacja korupcji, powszechność fake newsów, to wszystko jest wyznacznikiem upadku moralnego, czyli braku standardów moralnych, które by go wyznaczały. Chociaż wiele przyczyn tego moralnego upadku wskazuje na brak moralnego charakteru w naszym społeczeństwie, ale przede wszystkim brak cnoty.
And when virtue is not rightly and fully developed, there's no foundation on which to build our moral character. Virtue is a cornerstone of a strong moral character. And generally, virtue is a developed habit, a permanent disposition that becomes part of the character of the person. However, there are various understandings of habits, making our understanding of virtue problematic. The modern understanding of habits is more in the context of psychology, where it is considered as actions that are triggered automatically in response to contextual cues that have been associated with their performance. In social psychology, it is understood as an organized response to stimuli. This understanding of habit reduces it to the level of the involuntary and non-rational. In the general understanding, the real meaning of virtue has lost its significance, and to the point that to be virtuous is often interpreted as being abstinent or one who abstains from joyful living. For example, a woman is considered virtuous, or she may consider herself as virtuous because she neither drank nor smoked. Or a man may consider himself virtuous if he abstains from sex. While these are manifestations of virtuous character, it is a very narrow understanding of virtuous character, more so of virtue. This can be attributed to a very rigid moral training or condition or tradition or interpretation of morality. To be virtuous is often equated with a narrow moral attitude that is often judgmental of others. So the motivation of this paper is to bring to the fore the philosophical meaning of virtue through the notions of St. Thomas Aquinas and Karol Wojtyła. Through this, a positive and more holistic understanding of virtue can be provided. While they have their respective notions of virtue owing to their respective philosophical backgrounds, they both offer valuable insights into the nature and importance of virtue in achieving human flourishing, developing the moral well-being of individuals, and forming moral character. So this paper is divided into 4 parts. The first part is a general discussion on virtue. The second is a discussion on St. Thomas' notion of habit and virtue. The third is Wojtyła's notion of human act and virtue. And the fourth, an attempt at synthesizing the thoughts of St. Thomas and Karol Wojtyła on virtue. Very briefly, the general notion of virtue. The term virtue comes from Latin root vir for man, or virtus, et virtus, which meant manliness, strength, or valor, but over time it came to mean moral excellence. Thus, virtue means moral excellence based on right action and right thinking, which produces goodness of character. Virtue is an essential quality of a person that defines the human goodness of the individual. It is deeply rooted in human character and is a capacity that a person can develop. We can trace the first articulation of the nature of virtue to the Greek thinkers who developed theories for evaluating conduct based on the excellence of an individual's character. For Socrates, the good life consists in the practice of the virtues. Virtue is knowledge. Plato, following his mentor Socrates, identified virtue with self-control and freedom from desires. Likewise, Aristotle relates virtue to happiness. For him, happiness is not a passive state that we achieve, but it characterizes what we do and how we do it. The way to happiness involves knowing the right principles to follow and applying these principles in real life. For Aristotle, the performance of an activity must be in accordance with virtue or excellence. If we look at the East, we can also look at Chinese sages like Confucius, who also stress the importance of cultivating virtues as the foundation of a good ethical and social life. Central to Confucius' teaching is the cultivation of moral or human virtues. Every normal human being, according to Confucius, cherishes the aspiration to become a superior man or a sage or a jinchi. Now, let me go to St. Thomas on habit and virtue. The nature of habit. St. Thomas discussed the nature of virtue in the Summa Theologiae, and he provides a causal definition of virtue by characterizing virtue as a good operative habit. But what is habit? The term habit is derived from the Latin habere, which means to have or possess. Habit or habitus means something that is truly had or possessed. To possess something is to have dominion over it, to be able to use it when one wants it. St. Thomas makes the connection between habit and possession when he compares a habit to a possession insofar as we have the thing possessed at our fingertips. It is something that we practice as if it is a second nature to us. When we possess the propensity to press the keys of our cell phone, it feels like typing the keyboard of our cell phones at our fingertips. St. Thomas further elaborates on the nature of habit as a quality or disposition by stressing 4 specifying features, namely, that it is stable, operative, violent, and nature-directed. First, a habit is a stable quality or disposition. And St. Thomas regards habit as difficile mobilis, that is, a disposition that is difficult to change. It is not an easy come, easy go kind of quality. He says, we call habits those qualities which, by reason of their very nature, are not easily changed, in that they have unchangeable causes. Habits reside in the faculties as stable dispositions or qualities that dispose the faculties to act in a certain way depending on the type of habit. So habit is not a transient quality, but an immanent quality of its bearer. One does not become a chain smoker by smoking one stick of cigarette. One does not become a generous person by one act of generosity. However, when one becomes a chain smoker, it will be difficult to break the habit. And similarly, a generous person will always act generously toward others. Second, habit is an operative quality. Habits are disposed towards acts or operations. By its very nature, habit is related to an act and to the subject or bearer to which it belongs. Since habits are not directly observable, they can be known only through the acts to which they dispose their bearer. So following Aristotle, St. Thomas states that habits results from repeated acts. He said, repeated acts cause a habit to grow. But if the act falls short of the intensity of a habit, such an act does not dispose to an increase of that habit, but rather to a lessening thereof. The habit, for example, of reading is increased by repeated acts of reading. And such habit can also be decreased and corrupted by repeated acts of indolence or laziness. Habits do not give us the power to act, but the power to act readily and with dexterity. A faculty without habit is a simple power to act. A faculty with habit is the power to act with perfection. Thus, habits become or are called second nature. The faculty is like first nature, and the habit is second. It is something that inclines or disposes act to act and perform our functions perfectly. Reading is a simple power or operation, but when we develop the habit of reading, then reading even difficult texts becomes easy. And when we perfect the skill of reading, we become excellent readers. Third, a habit has a valent quality, that is, one that is either good or bad. For St. Thomas, a habit is never value neutral. It is a disposition according to which something is disposed well or badly. Being good or bad belongs to the very concept of habit. Fourth, St. Thomas claims that habits are qualities that are nature-directed. It is important to understand what St. Thomas meant by nature, especially human nature. Nature is dynamic, not static. The nature of a thing is what that thing is. So generally speaking, the essence of anything, what its definition signifies, is called nature. While essence signifies what a thing is, it can be defined and known by the human mind. Nature signifies the essence of a thing insofar as it has an order to the proper operation of a thing, since nothing is without its characteristic operation. Now, let me go now to the nature of virtue. Since habits are value-laden and never value-neutral, they are either good or bad. And as mentioned, good habits are called virtues, and bad habits are vices. St. Thomas states, human virtue, which is an operative habit, is a good habit and operative of the good. According to St. Thomas, a good habit is one that disposes to an act fitting to the nature of the agent. As human beings, our nature is based on our rational nature, and anything against the order of our rational nature is properly against our nature as human beings, and anything that is in accordance with our rational nature is in accordance with our nature as a human being. Moreover, virtues are not only good habits because they are in accordance with our rational nature. They are good because they imply the perfection of a power. As habits, they enhance and perfect our natural powers. The virtue of temperance, for example, enhances or perfects our natural capacity for restraints, and justice enhances our capacity to be fair to others. Now, the virtue of anything is determined by the maximum of its power is capable, and the maximum of any power must be what is good, because evil implies a defect or a privation. Now, there are two requirements for an act to be perfect. First is that the act be right. Second, that the habit cannot be the principle of the contrary of the act. Hence, a principle of a good and bad act cannot be a perfect principle of a good act because habit is the perfection of power. That is why it must be the principle only of a good act and in no way of a bad. And St. Thomas, of course, distinguished the many types of virtues, but I will skip already that part. Okay. Let me go to Wojtyła's notion of human act and virtue. One of the main influences of Karol Wojtyła is St. Thomas, of course. And at the very foundation of Wojtyła's philosophy is a profound understanding of St. Thomas's philosophy, which served as an anchor as Wojtyła navigated through the philosophy of phenomenology. However, despite the significant influence of St. Thomas, Wojtyła developed his own notion of virtue as a rich and complex concept that emphasizes the importance of habitual disposition based on the human act, self-determination, reason, and integration. His discussion on virtue offers a deeper understanding of the nature of human action and importance of moral character. The human act. Wojtyła notes the slight difference in his use of act or chin, exclusively man's conscious action with the term actus humanus. The notion of the human act in the traditional sense gives more emphasis on deliberateness or voluntariness. In the Aristotelian tradition, human action is primarily an ethical category, and the basic consideration is the voluntariness and culpability of the human agent and the ethical character of the action. Hence, human acts must be distinguished from acts of man, which are involuntary action. While Wojtyła stresses that act, chin, in the scholastic sense, is defined as actus humanus, or more specifically, as actus voluntarius, his emphasis was on the anthropological significance or importance of the act, that is, the act as revealing the nature of the person. The act is a concretization of the dynamism proper to the human person because it is accomplished in a manner proper to the free will. Hence, it is only a man's deliberate or voluntary act that we can call an act or action. Furthermore, human action also means conscious action. Voluntary action must also be regarded as a conscious act because it is accompanied by consciousness. So when we say voluntary act, we implicitly refer to that kind of act that is related to the power of free will. Wojtyła emphasizes that man acts or performs an action, which is a fact that is given to us in experience. So he adds that the fact that I act is an experiential datum. However, this experiential fact is not an isolated fact, but is understood in relation to or in the context of the entire human dynamism, the total dynamism that refers to the totality of man's experience. The entire human dynamism includes all man's functions, powers, and faculties. However, not all that belongs to human dynamism is reflected in consciousness. There are functions or powers that are not accompanied by consciousness. There are functions and powers that operate even without us being conscious of them. My writing this paper is an act accompanied by my consciousness. I am aware of what I am writing and the fact that I am writing. When I take my meals, I am conscious as I eat. But the way the food is digested by my body is something that is no longer accompanied by my consciousness. The person himself causes human action. It proceeds from him and comes about him because of his own agency or efficacy. In the sense, the self or the I is at the center of the total lived experience of I act. When the person acts, it is the self that brings about the act and not anybody else. He experiences himself as the agent of the act. This is the moment of efficacy, the lived experience of being the agent of the act. When a person acts, he experiences himself as the cause of his action. He knows that it is he who brings the action into existence. The human act is self-determined act, and self-determination is the very basis of our freedom. We are free when we can determine not only our actions, but also ourselves. Thus, conscious and voluntary action is related to freedom. This freedom is manifested in the lived experience when man can move from the I can and I need not, to I want or I will. Since the act is the self's own and it is experienced as such, then it is also something that the self may or need not do. But the self can say, I will. This means that there are some things that a person can do but need not do. One can just sit in one corner and do nothing. One can take a book and read. It is in this instance that the person experiences the moment of freedom, the moment of efficacy, the moment of the will, the moment of self-determination. And since the self is the agent of his actions, he determines the act, and in the process determines himself. The notion of self-determination presupposes the complex structure of the human person. It points to man's specific complexity and to the two aspects of human action, namely self-possession and self-governance. According to Wojtyła, only the one who has possession of himself and is simultaneously his own soul in exclusive possession can be a person. Self-determination is possible only on the ground of self-possession. Only the person who really possesses himself, the one who really owns himself, can determine and decide for himself. Self-possession has as a consequence, another relation in the very structure of the human person, which relates to will and is indispensable for understanding self-determination. This is the relation of self-governance, which states the fact that the person who possesses himself can govern himself. Now, next point, virtue as habitual disposition of the will. For Wojtyła, virtue is a habitual disposition of the will, which enables the individual to act in accordance with reason and to achieve their fullest human potential. Virtue as a habitual disposition of the will is a stable and lasting quality that is developed through practice and repetition. In his analysis of chastity as a virtue, for example, Wojtyła explains that habit is more than an ability or provisional control over something. Rather, it is mastery or power over something. And since virtue is a habit, it is a permanent and constant mastery. And therefore, in the case of chastity, virtue assists the will and above all, the concupiscible power in mastering sensual movements. If the proficiency of mastering the concupiscence movement from sensuality is only provisional, even if one is able to manage it for some time, then it is not a fully matured virtue. The fully mature virtue is a habit that consists in keeping constantly in balance the concupiscent power by the habitual relation of the true good, which is defined by reason. Wojtyła emphasizes that virtue is guided by reason, which means the virtue involves the use of intellect and wisdom to discern what is good and what is right. So, Wojtyła, following St. Thomas, stresses the directive role of reason in human action. Such directive role of reason in action is determined mainly by a holistic view of the human being. Reason is part of the whole human person and performs its practical function within this whole. Now, virtue as the integration of the human person. Wojtyła stresses that virtue involves the integration of the human person, which means that it involves the harmonization of the individual's emotions, desires, and action. This integration is important because it enables individuals to act in a way that is consistent with their values and principles and to achieve their fullest human potential. Virtue integrates human faculties, such as intellect, will, emotions, to achieve a unified and harmonious action. Emotions belong to psychic dynamism, which refers to emotional experiences like stirring emotions or excitement. In particular, emotions and passions only happen in man as a subject. The happening and occurrence is spontaneous, which means that they are not a product of personal efficacy and self-determination. Spontaneity, which is the dynamic independence of emotions from the proper efficacy of the person, is from self-determination. It is possible that emotions take over the will and freedom in determination of the act, creating some kind of a tension between these two dynamisms. The tensions between the person's efficacy or self-determination and spontaneous emotivity happens when emotional dynamism introduces a spontaneous turn toward specific values. This, in turn, may be directed towards something attractive or a positive value, or away from something repulsive or a negative value. Man, for example, has an inclination toward anything perceived to be good and away from anything perceived to be evil. And on the level of the psyche, emotions follow the orientation of nature and expresses this natural inclination. Now, the key element in relieving the tension between emotivity or emotions and efficacy or the will is virtue or moral proficiency. And Wojtyła explains that the integration of the person in the act on the basis of emotivity proper to the human psyche is accomplished through habits, which from his viewpoint of ethics warrant the term virtues. So according to Wojtyła, the problem of integration consists in realizing the personal structure of self-governance and self-possession on the basis of psychological subjectivity, which is molded by various emotive events that cause spontaneous actions or repulsions. A person, for example, may feel sexually attracted spontaneously towards the opposite sex, and the challenge is to keep one's spontaneous feeling under control, thus keeping the personal structure of self-governance and self-possession intact. In this case, it is one's moral proficiency of virtue that will enable him or her to harmonize or integrate properly the personal structure and emotive subjectivity. And thus, Wojtyła asserts that this personal structure is realized in moral proficiencies or virtues. The virtue of love and chastity. Wojtyła highlights the inherently relational dimension of human existence and consequently of virtue. Virtuous actions are not performed in isolation, but have an impact on others and contribute to the building of a community. This relational dimension of virtue is expressed in the virtue of love. Wojtyła places a strong emphasis on the virtue of love, which he sees as the foundation of all other virtues. According to Wojtyła, love is a virtue that involves the intentional and deliberate choice to will the good of another person. He argues that virtue is a form of love that enables individuals to act responsibly and selflessly. Virtue integrates love and reason, enabling individuals to take responsible decisions that respect the dignity of others. And for Wojtyła, the human person is the most perfect being in the visible world. And one form of love that Wojtyła substantially discussed in the love between man and woman in the context of marriage. The growth of such love consists in integrating the different processes that are spontaneously happening in the human person. For example, sexual attraction and sexual emotion in a conscious act of the whole person that also involves his rational faculties. True love does not happen in the person, but involves the experience of being an efficient cause of the act of love. It involves the act of the will. It springs from the human spirit. Now, let me go to my last part. The relevance of virtue, a kind of synthesis. The insights of both St. Thomas and Karol Wojtyła on virtue remain profoundly relevant for contemporary ethical discourse. Virtue theories stress the importance of developing good habits or character or virtues. Virtue as a state of character means that a morally good or virtuous person is not just one who performs morally right action, but one who has developed a habit or disposition to do what is right. He is one who has controlled or moderated his emotions, desires, and appetites, subordinating them to reason and will. A well-formed character not only tells the truth, but readily, happily, and easily tells the truth. Such character is manifested in one's motives, desires, and intention. Hence, the virtuous person delights in virtuous action and dislikes vicious or immoral action. Once a person has acquired the virtue of charity, he will then habitually act in a charitable manner. Once a person has developed the virtue of moderating his appetites and sexual desires, he will be able to subordinate and such appetites and desires to reason and will. Since Wojtyła followed the thoughts of Thomas Aquinas, there are apparent similarities between their concepts. For example, both consider virtue as a good habit, that is, habitual disposition, that enables the individual to act in a moral way based on reason and will. However, we can also see that St. Thomas and Wojtyła have contrasting philosophical focuses. First, St. Thomas Aquinas employs a metaphysical approach, drawing heavily on Aristotelian categories. He places discussion of the virtue within the parameters of ethics and moral philosophy. Wojtyła, on the other hand, utilizes a phenomenological method, focusing on the lived experience of the person and the emotive and personal dimensions of moral action. Second, while Aquinas acknowledges the importance of reason and will, Wojtyła's analysis, aside from highlighting the role of these rational faculties, delves deeper into the experiential aspect of moral action. He places a greater emphasis on the subjectivity or subjective agency of the person in exercise of virtue, highlighting the role of consciousness, freedom, and self-determination. And lastly, St. Thomas is more focused on the perfection of rational power, highlighting the cardinal and theological virtues. Wojtyła, on the other hand, is more focused on the integration of the human person, emphasizing the relational dimension of virtue expressed in the virtue of love that affirms the personhood of others. Beyond this contrast, we can see a complementarity of their thoughts on virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas and Karol Wojtyła, in their respective notion of virtue, focus not only on the goodness of particular action, but in perfecting human powers and capacity and on developing the character of the human person, ensuring that the person would always act in accordance with the norms or moral standards and ultimately developing good moral character. Morally good person will be disposed to follow the laws, relate ethically and harmoniously with others, based on respect for the dignity of persons, perform his duties, and consider the welfare and happiness of other people. I will skip some parts. I will go to the last paragraph because my time is up. St. Thomas' framework provides a comprehensive understanding of the nature and classification of virtue, offering a clear guide for moral formation. His emphasis on the cardinal and moral virtues is foundational for a well-ordered life, and the theological virtues as essential for ultimate human fulfillment continues to offer a valuable framework for moral decision and action. Wojtyła's phenomenological approach complements Aquinas' framework by highlighting the subjective dimensions of virtuous action. His emphasis on consciousness, self-determination, responsibility, love, the emotions, and desires provides a richer understanding of the interiority of the human person. In a world often characterized by moral decay and absence of moral character and virtue, manifested in moral relativism, disrespect for human person and life, and the many moral illnesses we have mentioned at the beginning of this paper, St. Thomas' teaching underscored the importance of cultivating stable dispositions towards the good. And Wojtyła's insight reminds us that genuine virtue stems from a free and responsible embrace of the good, rooted in the truth and resulting in a total integration of the person. Their combined perspective offers a richer and positive understanding of virtue that serves as an antidote to moral decay in our society and a reminder that true human flourishing is inextricably linked to the cultivation of virtue. Thank you very much.